Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Today, we are going to be discussing migrant workers and legislation that needs to be passed to better protect them. We want to thank Senator Vasconcelos for coming and listening to our pitch, and we look forward to talking with you at the end about our ideas. So our agenda today is the background on migrant workers and the problems that they encounter in the U.S., some proposed solutions that we think will help migrant workers to better protect them, and then we'll open it for questions and comments. So some statistics on migrant workers in the U.S. So there are 28.4 million foreign-born persons in the U.S. labor workforce. That is a large amount of people that are working in the U.S. that are foreign-born. So it is very essential that we look into laws to protect them. And 72% of farm workers are foreign-born, which is a huge portion of farm workers. Their median salary is $800 in comparison to the median median salary for non-foreign born workers is $940. So obviously there's a big disparity there, and their average yearly income is $12,500 to $14,999, which is extremely low, and is barely a livable wage and income. So there obviously needs to be a lot done to better protect them. And another very important fact is that they make up 17.4% of the total US workforce, which is almost 1/5, which is a very, very large number. And we would not be able to run our economy or any of those jobs without them. So these are just a few of the reasons that we need to pass more legislation and better protect migrant workers. And just to make it clear, a migrant worker is defined as all international migrant workers who are currently employed or unemployed and seeking employment in their present country of residence. And this is the definition by the International Labor Organization.
So some problems concerning migrant workers is a 2020 press release from the Bureau of Labor Statistics states that foreign-born workers are more likely to be employed in service positions compared to native-born workers. And service positions include things like agriculture, construction, maintenance, production. And the lack of workers' rights and power imbalances contribute to endangerment of migrant workers' health and safety. And because these are service positions like agriculture, migrant workers are more likely to take unnecessary health risks because of machinery and other factors. And certain sectors like agriculture are less likely to offer protection to migrant workers, and because there are multiple safety risks. And the American Journal of Industrial Medicine states that over half of farm workers in the agriculture sector are not legally authorized to work in the US because they are migrants, and it makes it less likely for them to report safety concerns. And the Department of Justice, through the National Worker Exploitation Task Force, recognizes that there is an issue here. Okay, and this graph just demonstrates how there is a lot of safety concerns when it comes to migrant workers. They're more vulnerable to fatalities and injury compared to native-born workers, especially because they are in service sectors.
So we wanted to provide some examples of past legislation on migrant workers and the protections that they are already given, but obviously there needs to be more done. So we just wanted to give a background on that. So some of the background, some of the some of the past legislation has been the National Worker Exploitation Task Force. So this is a federal interagency effort to combat severe worker exploitation and trafficking, um, human trafficking. The mission of the task force is to investigate, prosecute, and prevent trafficking in people and to protect the victims of trafficking and other exploitative work practices by ensuring that they receive rightful wages, appropriate services, and assistance. Just like and I was talking about, they are more vulnerable to being hurt, and this is a task force that looks into trying to protect them. But obviously, not enough has been done, as shown by the previous graph. Next, there's also the International Convention on the Protection of Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. This is obviously an international convention, and it was put forth by the United Nations, and it specifically outlines migrant workers' rights. The convention aims at protecting migrant workers and members of their families. Its existence sets a moral standard and serves as a guide and stimulus for the promotion of migrant rights in each country. So, for example, one of the parts of the law says migrant workers and members of their family shall have the right to receive any medical care that is urgently required for the preservation of their life, or the avoidance of irreparable harm to their health on the basis of equality of treatment. Um, so, obviously, they have put forth some rights and laws, but they are not always followed. It is very crucial to point out, though, that a lot of countries, especially focusing on the United States, have not signed, ratified, or adopted this treaty. So these rights may seem basic to US citizens, but unfortunately, not everyone is lucky enough to have them.
Next, we just wanted to touch on some proposed changes that we think will help bring real change to the lives of migrant workers and really protect their safety.
All right, so there are three main solutions we are proposing that are not only feasible but effective as well. And we believe these changes can serve as a stepping stone or like a foundation for future improvements to build upon for working conditions of migrants and the labor movement as a whole. And I'm going to give a brief description of each one, and I'll go more in depth in the following slides. So the first one has to do with language, and we believe all documents, written or spoken, should be provided in various languages, especially those in which the majority of migrant workers within the area speak. The second is unionization, to provide domestic and farm workers with the protections provided by the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. And the third is regarding a UN treaty, which Mackenzie talked about, and we call on the US to ratify that treaty governing migrant workers' rights. All right, so under Executive Order 13166 issued by President Clinton in August of 2000, the government was tasked with the duty to make federal agency services accessible to those with limited English proficiency. And this executive order is not widely enforced because of broad interpretation of what the phrase meaningful access includes. And as a result, millions of migrant workers and just immigrants in general are not provided with the resources to access government services they are entitled to. And the gravity of not providing sufficient language accommodation was established in the 1974 Supreme Court case, Lau versus Nichols, in which the Burger Court held that not providing adequate language accommodation to non-English speakers would impede their access to public services, and it would be in violation of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So we call on the administration to ensure Executive Order 13166 is implemented and upheld in all federal agencies. And in addition to upholding that executive order, we call on the administration to reverse the regulations to Section 1577 of the Affordable Care Act made by the Trump administration. And these changes made by the Trump administration greatly reduced protections that provided services and access to interpretation and translation services with for individuals with limited English proficiency. All right. Right, so the second solution was regarding unionization, and it's another significant change we believe would greatly benefit migrant workers, and it would be providing agricultural and domestic workers access to the provisions of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. And the NLRA provided workers with the right to join trade unions, defined unfair labor practices, and established the National Labor Relations Board. And at the time that this NLRA was passed, these industries were dominated by African Americans and women. And agricultural and domestic workers specifically were excluded from the NLRA as a compromise with Southern members of Congress who sought to uphold racist Jim Crow laws. And the Economic Policy Institute, using data from 2017-2019, reports that 35.1% of domestic workers are foreign born, and the USDA reports that 43% of agricultural workers were foreign born. And the exclusion of these occupations from the NLRA significantly reduces the ability of migrant workers to collectively bargain for fair labor practices and working conditions. All right, so this is a little bit of a continuation about what Mackenzie talked about earlier. But in 1990, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families was adopted by some UN member states. And as of December 2019, 55 states have ratified it, excluding the United States. And like Mackenzie said, it sets a moral standard for the treatment of migrant workers and their families. It declares that all migrants should have access to a minimum degree of labor protection, and that all undocumented immigrants must be treated with the same respect for humanity as regular migrants and non-migrant workers. And it was implemented and is overseen by the UN Committee on Migrant Workers. And the UN member states who have ratified this treaty are primarily countries of origin of these migrant workers, meaning it's where the countries where these immigrants are coming from rather than to. And no country in these predominantly migrant receiving areas of North America or Western Europe have ratified the convention. So we believe the ratification of this convention by the US would display the country's commitment to basic human rights of migrant workers and would hopefully influence other countries to do the same.
So that is our presentation and our proposals. And we just wanted to bring that to your attention, Senator Vasconcelos, and see if you could go ahead and push forward these ideas that we have in the Senate. So we just want to know if you have any questions, comments, concerns.
Of course, of course. I just have a question on how will these benefit the general American population?
I can answer that, Senator. So studies from the Center for American Progress show that fair labor practices through fair wages often promotes and positively impacts the U.S. working environment and economy. Because migrant workers are going for jobs that different skill sets than what most Americans choose, it really promotes them to spend more when they have fair wages, which in turn helps the economy and everyone else. And then manufacturing jobs stay in the US instead of being sourced overseas. And it creates a demand for related services such as transportation. And another point that that study made was it promotes job growth and wage increases for the African American and Hispanic Latino American community.
This is my second question. How will this positively impact the US economy?
I can answer that. It's going to positively affect the US economy because, well, number one, when you have workers who are happy and are protected and get good benefits, they are in turn more productive and this can have a trickle down effect to, various parts of our economy because as seen, they are a huge part of our workforce, especially within the farming industry. So that'll lead to, more crops, possibly better crops, just overall a better environment for these people. In addition, it will just make sure that American workers say they do want to work in these primarily migrant worker fields, that they can, because the pay can now be competitive since most of the time migrant workers are underpaid. An American citizen can't really take that job due to our minimum wage and all of those um, legislations around that. So now an American born person might be able to take those jobs, and this will lead to a decrease in unemployment.
Sounds good. Sounds good. My last and final question: how will this be enforced by the U.S. government?
All right, I can answer that. It's a great question. So, like I said, there were three main changes to this problem, which we outlined in the previous slides. There was language, exclusion from unionization, and the UN treaty. So they're each going to be enforced in different ways. Since the problem with the Executive Order 13166, I believe it was, it's not a lack of enforcement, but it was the generalized language, particularly that phrase meaningful access, that was used in the order. So to effectively enforce the implementation of that executive order, there needs to be a revision in the actual text of the EO. And since new orders can amend earlier ones, the administration could issue a newer executive order specifically outlining guidelines regarding language accommodation that all federal agencies must follow. And since all executive orders have the effect of law, they'll just be enforced accordingly. And for the problem of exclusion from unionization, if the National Labor Relations Act was revised to include farm and domestic workers, it would be enforced via federal labor law and the National Labor Relations Board, which acts as like an overseeing agency for all unions nationwide. And adherence to the UN treaty would be enforced by the UN Committee on Migrant Workers and not the US federal government.
Sounds really good. Honestly, you guys have a really good idea, and I hope to talk with my legislative team and get this sent forward.
That's awesome to hear. Thank you so much for coming today and listening. We hope we can see these proposals in action.
I hope so. I feel a change coming soon. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Senator.
You.